to get into this goofy state where we appeared to be signed in even though we weren't. Because I signed out from another window, which totally signed me out of Firebase, but it didn't sign me out of this app because it still had my user in state. So there's a better way we could have for determining whether we're signed in or not. If you look at the documentation for authentication here, let's just go to help. User management help, here we go. If I go to authentication, click on the little help icon, user management help, manage users, blah, 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 Firebase developer documentation, here we go. Authentication, let's look at manage users. Get the currently signed in user. The recommended way to get the current user is by setting an observer on the auth object. Firebase auth, that's the auth object, which we export from base.js. On auth state changed. So on auth state changed waits for the authentication status to change one way or the other. Waits for you to sign in, waits for you to sign out. You pass it a callback that will get called whenever that changes. So it'd be a good idea to start listening for that as soon as the page loads. So in app.js, I don't believe we're doing anything on component did mount. We are not. So let's do that. Let's add a component did mount to app. Component did mount. So when's that going to run? It's automatically going to run right after render is called the first time. So as soon as the component renders, it's going to start listening to whether our Firebase authentication status has changed. That's what this is going to do. And things like component did mount are only available if your component is a class, not available on stateless functional components. So besides the need for state, that's another reason you might need to have a class. And we want to do something very much like this. Now, of course, we don't use function like this. We use arrow functions. We're cool kids. There we go. Let's do this a little more. And firebase.auth, well, we import that as auth from base. So that is just auth.onStateChanged. So here's the idea. I don't need to call handle auth from sign in anymore. Never mind all this. Oh, not handle submit. This doesn't do anything right now anyway, because we don't have the form working. But ditto here. But up in authenticate, we call sign in with pop-up, then we call handle auth. Don't need to do that. Just need to call sign in with pop-up. That will change our authentication status. Our auth state will change if we sign in with pop-up. An app component will notice because we set up this observer. So when the state changed, it will automatically call this callback right here. So if there's a user, that means we signed in. So we should call this.handleAuth. Otherwise, we're signed out. So we should do whatever we do after you sign out. So that would be these two things. That's what happens after you sign out, right? So let's do this. Let's add another function. We have handle auth. Let's do handle unauth. You can call it after sign out or something if you want. What this is going to do is remove the user from state and from local storage. So this should happen after you sign out. So notice this will have the user object. On-auth state changed, we know from the documentation, the user object gets passed in. If it's present, we want to call handle auth and pass it along. If we're signed out, there's nothing to do with that. The user object isn't there. So let's go over the whole flow again. As soon as app.js loads, as soon as it renders the first time, it's going to start listening for our auth status to change. It's going to wait to see whether we are signed in or signed out of Firebase. If in sign in, we sign in, we'll say auth sign in with pop-up. App.js will notice, oh, my auth status changed. Is there a user? Yes, there sure is. Let's call handle auth. And it'll do what it did before. If I click the sign out button, it'll call auth.signout. And then this will be like, oh, auth state changed again. Let's call handle on auth. And it'll do these two things to clear it out of state and local storage. So this thing's just sitting there all the time, just waiting for our auth state to change one way or the other, waiting for us to sign in or sign out. So that means I don't even need to pass handle auth down to sign in anymore. Don't even need it. Let's see what happens. Sign out, refresh, still signed out. Sign in. That works. Refresh, still signed in. But check this out. Let's open a new window. Let's go there. Sign out. Signed out of the other window too. Because it was just waiting for us to sign out. And as soon as it noticed that we were, it called handle on auth. Let's sign in from this window. This one notices that we signed in and signed us in. So our state will get updated whenever we sign in or out. So we won't be left in this weird state where we appear to be signed in, but we're not. And thus we can't read any data. So we fixed that weird little edge case. If we sign out of Firebase, our state will reflect the fact that we have signed out. Because before we could have a user in state, which means we're signed in, even though we weren't actually signed in. This prevents that from happening. Again, that's under the Manage Users in Firebase section, under Get the Currently Signed In User. That's how this works. So setting up observers and stuff, it's not something we do a lot in this class. We don't have time. But here's a pretty good example of it. So it's just sitting there waiting for our authentication status to change one way or the other. When it does, it notices, hey, is there a user? Yes, handle auth. No, handle on auth. Means we signed out. And calling sign in with pop-up is enough to trigger this. Calling auth.signout is enough to trigger this. So all the stuff that should happen after you sign in or sign out, we handle from here. And all those two functions have to do is actually sign in and actually sign out. The fact that we want to update state and stuff when we do that, we handle that from here. Handle changes to authentication status. You dig? See the problem that it solves? Any of that make sense to anyone at all? Yeah. Yeah, not working? Okay.